Welcome to Bucket Questions, Episode 10. I'm filming in my kitchen today because today's question is a food science question, which is what makes a bagel be a bagel and not just regular bread? And there is actually quite a bit of science involved in cooking and baking, lots of chemistry, lots of biochemistry going on, the way that chemical flavors mix, the way that heat interacts with sugars and proteins and changes their shape, which changes their flavor and texture. Lots of stuff going on, but let's talk about bread. Bread is made from grain, and most of those grains are going to be wheat. Those are the breads we're more familiar with, in addition to things like corn and oats and barley. Now, grain is actually, and most grains are members of the grass family, so they're really just a kind of grass. And if you let your own grass in your yard grow up long enough, eventually it will make seeds, will make tiny little flowers, which you'll barely even notice, and then those flowers can get pollinated and make a head of seeds like we see on this wheat stalk. And it's these seeds that we then harvest and grind up to make flour, which we then use to make our bread. So another important ingredient in bread is what makes bread be leavened bread as opposed to unleavened bread. And unleavened bread is going to be flat bread like this tortilla here. And leavened bread is going to be kind of the puffier bread that we're more used to with air holes and things like that. And the ingredient that makes flat bread flat, it's not they have an extra ingredient, it's that they're missing an ingredient. And that ingredient is yeast. Now, when you add yeast to water, what you're really doing is you're waking up little microorganisms. Yeast are microorganisms. They're one cell big. So this is under a compound microscope. That's a pile of yeast cells. And what some of them are doing is growing. And so some of them are bigger and smaller than others. And some of them, like this one right here, is budding. And you can see that over in this picture as well. This is an electron microscope picture of yeast cells. And therefore it can get to much higher magnifications, as well as give you a more three-dimensional picture of what yeast cells look like. And these yeast cells down here and down here, they are budding as well. So when animal cells reproduce, they basically split more or less in half. When a yeast cell reproduces, it just pinches off just a little bit of itself to make a whole new cell. And then that cell will grow into a larger cell and the process can begin all over again. So yeast, being alive, needs to eat. And the thing that yeast is going to eat is sugar. The process by which yeast digests sugar is called fermentation. And the fermentation process takes place when sugar, which is C6H12O6, so this right here is the chemical formula for sugar, particularly for the sugar glucose or fructose. They're the same chemical formula, but that's a story for a different day. So glucose sugar is C6H12O6. And animals digest glucose sugar through a process called cellular respiration, in which the byproducts of that are carbon dioxide and water. But fermentation, done by yeast, happens by a much simpler metabolic process in which carbon dioxide is still released, but the glucose is split roughly in half, and to make this particular chemical, C2H6O. And that is the chemical formula for ethanol. So the yeast, when it digests sugar, makes two products that humans have taken advantage of for hundreds of thousands of years in our food science. And carbon dioxide is what we're interested in for bread production, and ethanol is what we're interested in for other kinds of refreshments. So if I let my yeast sit long enough in my container, then what is going to happen is that the yeast is going to undergo its fermentation and it will release carbon dioxide, and then we'll end up with a layer of carbon dioxide bubbles at the top of this container of yeast. And it's those bubbles, when they're in the bread, that cause the bread to rise and to get all of these little holes that are in the bread. And flatbread, like my tortilla here, does not contain yeast, so the bread doesn't rise and it doesn't get as airy as the what we think of as kind of normal kind of bread. So when we make bread, first we tend to put the yeast into warm water to kind of wake up the yeast cells that have basically been in hibernation and rehydrate them. Then we have to give them a source of sugar. And usually in bread making, that sugar is in the dough itself. This is an experiment that I did a few years ago back in the old science room, where we have two flasks, one that contains sugar water, one that contains just plain water, and we put equal amounts of yeast in them, and then we put balloons over the top. Now, once the yeast begins to metabolize, they will release carbon dioxide. And the yeast in the no sugar water have released a small amount of carbon dioxide, probably from any sugars they had stored within their cells, and that carbon dioxide has gotten trapped in this balloon. But the yeast here that have extra sugar in the water have been able to continue to metabolize, and you can see that this balloon has expanded more than the no sugar balloon, as well as you can also kind of see that the layer of bubbly foam is a little bit thicker. This particular experiment had probably been sitting about half an hour, and if I had left it even longer, this balloon would have gotten even bigger. The yeast will continue to metabolize and divide. And that is what makes our bread dough rise when we let it sit before we bake it, is that the yeast start metabolizing the sugar that's in the dough, releasing carbon dioxide as a byproduct, and causing all the dough to puff up. It works better when it's warmer, so sometimes when my kitchen is cold, I kind of help the yeast along by taking a pan or bowl of hot water and putting the rising dough above it so that the steam will continue to heat the yeast and activate its metabolism and let the dough rise. So what this really means, if you really think about it, is that bread rises because of yeast farts. So the first start of making bread is letting the yeast do its metabolism to fart out carbon dioxide to make your dough rise. And then the second part is baking it. And the baking is going to have several effects on your dough. One of them is that the heat will change the shape of the starches in the bread, as well as any of the grain proteins. And when those change shape, you get a nice crunchy crust, and your dough texture changes and becomes nice and soft instead of sticky. And so there's a bunch of chemistry involved in baking bread. But the other thing that happens when you bake your bread is that you slowly kill the yeast, and so the yeast stops metabolizing, the bread does not rise any longer, and the yeast cells die, and also maybe add a little bit of flavor to your bread. And when you bake bread, both of these processes, both the biological yeast process and the chemical browning and changing of the shapes of the proteins and sugars, those all happen more slowly. What makes bagels different? What makes bagels different is that before they're baked, they're actually boiled. The dough is shaped and then dropped in a pot of boiling water. And what that does is it kills the yeast quickly so that you end up with a denser dough on the inside because the yeast have quickly stopped metabolizing. They've still metabolized some, as you can see from some of the air pockets, but they stop metabolizing quicker than in a regular loaf of bread. And the other thing is that the boiling quickly changes the shape of some of the starch molecules that are on the outside, creating a crust rather quickly so that the inside does not change shape in the same way that a regular loaf of such as this French bread would. And so that gives the inner dough a more chewy texture because of a different level of changing shape of the starches and the proteins. So what makes bread bread is starting with some kind of grain. What makes bread be leavened bread is adding yeast and letting it rise. What makes it have a crust is the way that we bake it. And what makes a bagel is boiling it ahead of time to change the rate at which the yeast die and the proteins and sugars change shape to create the doughy, dense texture that we love about bagels.